Hello again and welcome to another Morty and Glory Warhammer 40k video. In today's episode, we shall be observing and analysing an Imperial Guard list that recently went to a super major GT and not only went undefeated, but also won the entire event. This list is really interesting because it's a perfect example of how powerful Guard can be in the current meta and how they have been slept on for a really long time, since the beginning of 10th edition. Now, I have gone through this list prior to making this video, and I find it fascinating. There are lots of units in this army which are familiar and that I 100% agree with, and there are a lot of units that when I first looked at them went, that's an interesting choice. But once I started peeling back the layers and learning a bit more about how it all came together, I was blown away. So there's loads and loads of interesting information here, guys. And I think it's going to be really useful for everyone, including myself, to go through this and understand how this whole thing comes together. But with all of that said, let's not mess around any further. Let's fix bayonets and charge right into today's episode. Now, the first thing I want to do is give credit where credit is due and say a huge well done to David Gaylard, who was the man, the myth, the legend who piloted this list to victory. David and his co-host Vic actually have a podcast called the Fireside podcast, and I'll make sure that there is a link to that down in the description below. And I highly encourage you to go over and take a look at it because both players are extremely experienced and they have a huge amount of intimate knowledge about the game. And what's really funny is a few weeks ago on their podcast, they did a faction tier list and they put Guard at the very top, saying that they haven't got any bad matchups and that they would be able to win a super major GT. And the stir that this caused on the internet, there was much chit and chat around the proverbial water cooler, and people were saying that they were mad, that there's no way Guard were good. Guard were a terrible faction, were bottom tier, they're 40% win rate, they need all sorts of buffs, and that these guys just didn't know what they were talking about. But lo and behold, a week or so later, David took Guard to a super major GT and not only won every single game, but also won each one big enough that he got the gold. He came home with the first place prize, which is incredibly impressive. So a huge well done to David for putting his money where his mouth is. But how did he do it? What was in his list that allowed him to achieve victory in the Emperor's name? Well, let's get into it. Starting off, we have the characters, and we have two Leman Russ tank commanders. A surprise to be sure, but a welcome one. A lot of people have dismissed tank commanders due to the fact that they're quite expensive and you only get one tank order with them unless you're willing to upgrade one of the tank commanders to have Grand Strategist, which David did do in this case. But either way, it's like 400 plus points to get 3 orders when you could just take the Lord Solar, right? Well, here's the thing. What if you took both? Because in addition to the 2 tank commanders, there was also the Lord Solar Leontus, and we had Ursula Creed as well. Now, of course, Ursula Creed and Leontus have got their fixed loadouts, but the tank commanders, they had a little different things going on there. So the first one had a Hunter Killer Missile, Demolisher Battle Cannon, Lascannon, 2 multi-melters, and a heavy stubber. The second one, which had Grand Strategist, did have Hunter Killer Missile, did have a Demolisher, did have a Lascannon, but then it had 2 Militarum plasma cannons. So we're seeing a mixture of both multi-melters and plasma. Both of these sponsons are really good choices right now. Multi-melta have got a reliable number of shots and they've got that higher strength and AP, but the plasma cannons can get a lot more shots if you end up going into some infantry. The fact that each one benefits from blast is wild, and they've got the range as well, which means if you need to keep your tank commander back just a little bit, not too much, because obviously you want to take advantage of that Demolisher cannon, you can do so. Speaking of the Demolishers, it's great to see the Demolisher making a bit of a comeback. It was a weapon that was a favorite of tanks in both 8th edition and 9th edition. It dropped off a little bit at the beginning of 10th when people started seeing what the Leontus exterminators can do, but there's no point in putting an exterminator battle cannon on a tank commander. The main reason you take the exterminator is to act as a force multiplier, but you don't get that with the tank commander because the exterminator's withering hail is an ability of the tank, not of the weapon. So in this case, if you go for tank commanders, you might as well just have the biggest, punchiest, blastiest, most damage dealing weapon, and that is the Demolisher. Small side note here, I personally am not a huge fan of the Demolisher, and I know that's going to sound like a really stupid thing to say in the context of how well this list is done, but I don't dislike the Demolisher because I think it's a bad weapon. I think it's got a decently reliable number of shots with D6+3, incredible strength, incredible AP. What I personally don't like about the Demolisher cannon is the swingy damage, the D6 damage. Because whenever I've used Demolisher cannons, they've always rolled a 1 or a 2 for the damage, like just consistently. So I put a bit more faith and a bit more stock into flat damage through weapons, but that is completely and utterly a personal preference based on my own experience. So I do acknowledge that the Demolisher is a really, really good weapon. After this, we get into the battle line units, and there are only 2. I know it makes my little Mordian glory just soul hurt when I only see 2 battle lines, but don't worry, it's not as bad as you think. We've got 1 unit of 10 Catachan jungle fighters, and we have got 1 unit of infantry with a mortar and a grenade launcher. Fundamentally, it's just a really great way of saving 60 or even more points. If you're not taking the extra squad and you're not taking the platoon command squad to create the Supreme Command blob, then you are saving a lot of points. You're saving enough for an extra Catachan squad. I've actually gone and watched a couple of the Fireside chats where David talks about this, and he says that essentially there is no fat in his list. His list is completely and utterly lean, and he always likes, when he's building his list, he likes to ask himself, do I need this unit or can I just play better? And the way he sees it is if the Lord Solar is just going to be sat there and he's never going to need the 24-inch range orders, then he doesn't need, he can just save those points by playing more cleverly, by just playing better. It's just a great way of saving 60 or more points, because not only do you save points to the command squad, but you save points on the infantry unit that all of this is going to attach to as well. So you're saving about 115 to 120 points depending on if you're attaching them to a command squad, to a Catachan unit, or to a infantry squad. This does allow you to get more stuff in the list, but I can't help but wonder, and I know that it's kind of funny that I am daring to criticize this list when, you know, it has done very, very well. But I can't help but wonder if it's a little risky. With no bodyguard, with no bladed wounds for the Lord Solar, as long as the enemy doesn't have any indirect fire, he's safe. But what happens if guard players start busting out the artillery again? What if we start seeing a surge in guard numbers? Or we just start seeing a surge in just people in general bringing more indirect fire? And you probably won't see a lot of other factions bring indirect fire because, well, there's a lot of it's been nerfed, like the Whirlwind and the X system and whatnot. But there's plenty of guard players out there which have got armadas of basilisks and stuff that they can draw upon. And you've also got a number of factions that can like deep strike very, very close. Like we've got like Tau that are going to start deep striking 3 inches. We've got Marines that can deep strike in 3 inches. And if there's like a little gap or there's some way for the Lord Solar to get targeted, then he just dies. I've actually been in a game where I had Lord Solar command blob and lots of artillery, and my opponent basically the same thing, and he didn't have a command blob with his Lord Solar. He was doing this kind of tactics. He was like, oh, I'm just going to sit next to my artillery, and I got first turn, I just killed the Lord Solar. That meant that his artillery was way less effective, and then overall I ended up just winning the artillery duel. So I do wonder how this list would change if we saw a rise in things that could start targeting the Lord Solar consistently. But going back round to the battle line, if the Catachans aren't forming a Lord Solar command blob, then what are they doing? Well, they are 10 cheap infantry that have scout. One of the big things that David speaks about with this list is how much movement shenanigans guard have, how many pre-game moves we have, and Catachans are incredibly cheap. They're 55 points for 10 bodies that can scout move at the beginning of the game. Now, you can use this in a number of different ways. If you go first, it allows you to scout move onto an objective. There's also a Chimera in this list, so you could put the Catachans in the Chimera and scout move them forward. So the Chimera scout moves, and then the Chimera can move. So you can start getting onto objectives early on. You can start doing secondaries early on. Gives you some ability to screen as well. If you're facing off against someone like Grey Knights, you can have a very, very mobile unit, either on foot or mechanized up. It's just a great little cheeky scout unit, and it's cheap enough where if you're facing someone who does have a lot of deep strike, you can take 10 infantry, and if you spread them out to the maximum level, you can create a huge deep strike denial zone as well. So having 10 scouting infantry that you can use both aggressively but also use defensively, they can, if you don't get first turn, you could just scout them into like a ruin or some cover, is just very, very effective. You can't go wrong with 10 scouting bodies and taking advantage of their movement shenanigans. The other battle line unit is the infantry squad. This is for Creed. Creed can go in the unit or she can go next to the unit depending on how you want to use her and how you want to use the squad. And essentially you use the mortar to do some indirect fire, and you only need to target the enemy, and then Creed can use her ability to do fields of fire for free, or the battle tactic stratagem for free. So Creed and the infantry squad are just there to add cheap additional AP as and where you need it. It's a much cheaper and also much more reliable way of doing this over, say, a Lemurus Exterminator. So Lemurus Exterminator is 180 points, and yes, it brings a lot of damage to the table, but it has to have line of sight. And on terrain dense boards, your Lemurus Exterminator might be over on the right flank, but the thing you really, really want to kill is on the left flank, and the Exterminator just can't see it. Well, Creed with the mortar can see anywhere because the mortar's got indirect fire, and even if the mortar doesn't hit, it doesn't matter. Fields of fire just says targeted. We then get into the other data sheets, and we begin with some Bulgrin, a big old squad of 6 of them. 6 Bulgrin is a hell of a chunky unit, and it is just a brick wall. They've got some decent combat output as well. They will be able to bully down onto other units, but by and large, it just comes down to how many 4-up invulnerable saves you can make. That's what the Bulgrin do. And anything, even things like Catachan, come flying into them, and it's just a case of how many 4-up invulnerables you can make. And if you make lots of them, then the unit will live, and if you don't make as many as you'd like, then the unit will probably suffer. But taking a big squad of 6 of them does give you a bit more reliability. Don't forget that Bulgrin not only have a 4% vulnerable save, they also reduce damage by 1, and they have a 6-up feel no pain. So there's multiple layers there that can make it so even high damage weapons, using like damage 4 or damage 5, d6 plus or 2 or something like that, even there's a few layers there that can mean that rather than 1 attack squashing a Bulgrin, it takes 2, which starts making the unit infinitely more survivable. In my mind here, the Bulgrin are fulfilling the same kind of role that a big 20-man blob of Krieg with a Deathclaw Marshal would. They're a big unit that can just screen and block and be a huge tar pit. But of course, they are doing it for 30 points cheaper. So that does worth bearing in mind. Again, go back to what David said at the beginning. If he can save points, he will save points. If there is a way that he can save points and achieve the same effect, but by playing better, then he will do. And I think these Bulgrins are another great example of that. Between these Bulgrins, he saved 30 points, and not spending points on the Platoon Command Squad and the Infantry Squad. We're looking at 150 points saved in this list so far, and yet no capability has been lost. After the Bulgrin, we have not 1, not 2, but 3 units of Catachan, the Cadian Warrior Elite. And all I can say is vindication! I have been going on and on and on about how good Catachan are. I started off 10th edition and I thought they were a bit rubbish, but the more I've looked at them, the more I've used them, the more impressed I've become by them. And it's great to see that other players, especially ones as skilled as David, and he is a very, very good player, I mean, clearly he is, picking up on that and also running them. Catachan are amazing for a whole number of reasons, and if you look at purely their damage output, you're kind of missing the main things they're bringing to the table. they scout. That's kind of the best bit. They scout, and when they actually get there, they can also do some damage. But it's the movement shenanigans that you can pull off with these guys. The fact that you can scout them forward if you get first turn, or you can scout them defensively. The fact that not only can they move, but then they can tell themselves to move, and also you can then have an extra order nearby, if you've got that available to you, to do extra orders on top of that, which increase their damage output. So you've got infantry that could be running around 9 inches. That's faster than Eldar infantry, getting there and hitting you on 2s with all sorts of special weapons and stuff like that. But I do think that it is the fact that these guys are scout and competent, and yes, they are 100 points and you're only getting 10 models, but there's advantages to that. Smaller units, easier to hide. Smaller units tend to be a little bit more wieldy, and they tend to be a little bit more rewarding if you like to play micro intensive. For those of you that are interested, these Catachan are equipped in a Classican style. That means they've got all the plasma and all the melta that you can get your hands on. What I really like about these Catachan is they add some much needed infantry to the list. I always say that a good guard army is based on 3 things. You've got infantry, you've got tanks, and you've got artillery. You can lean into one of those more than the other, but to have a really well done take all comers army, you want all 3 of those things. Now obviously we've got tanks in the form of the tank commanders, and as you'll see later on, we've got a lot of artillery, but the one thing that this list might have seemed to lack on the surface is infantry, but actually it's got lots of it, just in non-traditional formats. Rather than blobs of infantry moving around in sort of traditional platoon formats, rather we have got a unit of Catachans, possibly in a Chimera, a bit of a mech unit there. That's the equivalent of taking an infantry blob. I've always said that you want to take 80 infantry in your army, or the equivalent. What you essentially want is 4 to 5 units that can move around, do a bit of blocking, do a bit of objective play, and so you've got that in this list. You've got those Catachans. In a push, you've got the Creed blob. That's an extra few bodies you can call upon. You've got the Bulgarians. That's the equivalent of a 20-man blob. And then we've got 3 units of Catachan. Each one of the units of Catachan can easily do the same job as a 20-man blob of infantry. They've got the same amount of special weapons. They've got the orders. They look after themselves. Again, what would you rather have? If you're trying to be as lean as possible, what would you rather have? 20 infantry with an officer that's going to cost you 185, 190 points, or get basically the exact same effect for 100 points. There are going to be some trade-offs, like you don't have the raw bodies, and you won't have things like feel no pains and stuff like that, like you might have with the 20-man Krieg blob, but you are going to basically be half price. And so in this list, we have got multiple units that act as infantry. And some of them are pseudo infantry and some of them are actual infantry, but long story short, we've got 4 or 5 units here, maybe as many as 6 if you, like I said, start press ganging Creed's mob into combat if things start getting a little bit dicey. You've got 6 units that you can draw upon for taking objectives. You've got 6 units that you can draw upon for movement blocking, for screening, for doing secondaries. You've got lots of units that give you fantastic movement and tactical capabilities. But I mentioned that there is quite a lot of artillery in this list, and oh baby, we've got 4 artillery pieces. So we've got our 3 pillars, but in this particular list, we've leaned somewhat more into indirect fire. Double Basilisk, double Manticore, everyone with a heavy bolter, everyone with a hunter killer missile. Some of you may be surprised by the inclusion of Manticores, especially the fact that they cost 180 points now, but they're still very, very good. They can be swingy. D6 plus 1 shots does mean that if shooting against a big vehicle and you only get 2 shots and you won't get the rerolls because it's not got a value of 5 or more models, you might find that it's a little bit risky. But that's where you've got the Basilisk. The Basilisk bring the reliability. Every single time they're going to be slamming down at least 4 shots. Even if they don't kill anything, they're probably going to be causing all sorts of movement headaches. Remember, movement wins games. Not only your movement, but how you can mess up your opponent's movement. So Basilisk feed into that ability to control the game, shape the battlefield, and they bring the reliability in terms of firepower as well. The Manticores, a little bit more swingy, But when they pop off, if you roll out those 7 shots, they're going to be hitting on 2s, potentially rolling 1s in this list, which we'll get to in a little bit more later on. And they are going to hit with damage 3. And flat damage 3 is one of the greatest things that Guard brings to the table. The fact that you can have an entire army where, if you wanted it to, every single unit from your command blobs through to your vehicles can have flat damage 3 is awesome. It's a really, really good value. There are some units out there which I've got 4 wounds on each infantry, but by and large, the vast majority of infantry, even heavy infantry that you're going to come across, is going to have 3 wounds. By and large, most vehicles will go down to 4 unsaved manticore wounds because of the fact that it's flat damage 3. So they're really, really punchy, but you add the bastards in there to make sure that overall your artillery pack is a little bit more reliable. You've got punch and you've got reliability. Supporting this artillery, making sure that it's doing the job we need it to do, because it has to deliver on the damage output, because that's where we focused our attention. We've not only got the Lord Solar, who's going to be telling them to take aim, so they'll be hitting on 3s, but we've also got 2 Scout Sentinels. A couple of cheeky Scout Sentinels with Lascannons. Lascannons are good, probably the go-to Scout Sentinel weapon, or I think Scout Sentinel and Armor Sentinel weapon if you're going that way. You can't go wrong with more anti-tank in 10th edition. Scout Sentinels, we've got 2 lone ones of them. Now, this is a little bit risky because obviously if one of these Scout Sentinels go down, you might not have a good target for reinforcements. You might want to spend 2 CP on the Scout Sentinels when it comes back, but you might want to spend that on 10 Catachan. But the thing is that the Scout Sentinels can go into reserve, or you can start them on the board depending on what the terrain's like. And between their 9-inch scout move, which is really, really tasty, and then their 10-inch move, they can go 19 inches and start using Daring Recon. Now, Daring Recon allows you to pick an enemy unit, and anything that's indirect fire no longer suffers the -1 to hit penalty for firing indirectly, and you also get reroll 1s. This means that your basilisks and manticores, when take aimed and daring reconned, will be hitting on 2s, rerolling 1s, which is really, really spicy. That's where the punch is. Sure, your manticore might be a little bit swinging at dice rolls, but if it's hitting on 2s, rolling 1s, even if it only rolls 2 shots, they're both going to hit. It just makes it so your artillery starts going to the moon in terms of its accuracy. But you've also got the fact that Scout Sentinels are fairly cheap and disposable. So if you don't have a good target for your manticores or your basilisks, or you know you're not going to be able to get daring recon, it's still worth having these guys on the board potentially, or you can have them in reserve so they can come from a flank and see something they might not be able to see. It's on terrain heavy boards, but you can start them on the board if you're just like, well, I need a unit that it can go even faster than the scout mirror, the scouting chimera, and get me things like engage, get me things like extend battle lines, and I don't need to start spending hundreds of points to do that. I don't need to risk a viable Catachan unit. I don't need to risk a 125 point scout mirror unit. I can take a 60 point sentinel, and again I can start scout moving with it. And if you go through this army, look at how much scout is in it. You've got a chimera with the Catachans, you've got 2 scout sentinels, and you've got the Catachan as well. There are many units. We've got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units, 6 units all with scout, and what doesn't have scout has indirect fire. So I'm either going to move to see you and shoot you, or I'm just not going to see it and I'm still going to shoot you. And finally, I've mentioned it a few times already, but we have a chimera with double heavy flamer and heavy stubber. I'm a big fan of double heavy flamer chimeras. They've been great for many editions now, although you may see myself using a lot with double heavy bolter because I just like a good Daka chimera. I have 6 turrets that I can swap out on my chimeras at a moment's notice if I ever want to run them as heavy flamers. So I like the Daka chimeras, but I fully understand the heavy flamer chimera. Oh, it's not only good if you put the Catachans inside it with the new firing deck. That's 4 flames that can potentially fire on Overwatch, which might cause some players to hesitate or make them do a move they don't want to move. It might control movement. Again, we're talking about movement winning games. It helps control a little bit of movement there. But also, it's a unit that then doesn't rely upon take aim. There's only so many orders you've got even though we've got a lot of tank orders, with only so many of orders that you've got, you might want to have a unit or two that doesn't worry about those orders and can just go around auto hitting, having a great time. Looking at the list as a whole, bringing all this together, I know that some people will be surprised that we've only got 2 main tanks in this list, and there seems to be a huge emphasis on movement and indirect fire. There's a very good reason for that: dense terrain. A lot of the terrain in the UK and also in Europe is WTC or UKTC standard, and it is unbelievably dense. There are so many L-shaped ruins that vehicles, not even super heavies like a Shadow Sword, but vehicles like Land Raiders, which aren't considered like massive by today's standards, can't get out of their deployment zones. So what you need is to have an emphasis on indirect fire and movement, because indirect fire allows you to just give the big middle finger to all of those line of sight blocking ruins, and suddenly it starts giving you a huge advantage over your opponent. If you've got indirect fire and they don't, then they're having to struggle down these firing lanes and you're just pounding away. Also, you need movement. Specifically, you need movement on infantry, because infantry can breach through the walls. They can just move through all these ruins without a care in the world. If you go down more vehicles, if you go down a more tank heavy route, even if it's just, oh, I'm going to take like 2-3 Lehman Russes and a Rogel Dawn, you might find your Dawn in a lot of cases can't get out of deployment zone. If it can, it's got a very specific movement channel it's got to go down, and you might find that you've got a lot of vehicles that, even though they've got a movement value of 10, which should be faster than the infantry moving 6, because they can't just go as the crow flies, they can't just go in a straight line, they end up moving really slowly. And so having infantry that can be real fast with move, and having damage dealers that don't need to see the enemy is almost mandatory on these very, very dense terrain boards. I did a video recently talking about how impactful terrain is and how important it is, and how you should have a very clear understanding of what the terrain is in the tournament you're going to before you submit your list. And I think what we're seeing here with this list is a very good example of that. If you were to take this list and play it on a board that had a lot lighter terrain, maybe where you couldn't hide all of your indirect fire, it might struggle a little bit more, or it might not necessarily be as efficient. But if you play on a board that's much more dense, then this list is just incredible for doing that. The reason I mention this is if you're someone that's watching this video, or you've seen this list before, and you think that you can just take this list and it will automatically start winning games for you, I would caution against that. This list is going to work on certain terrain types, but specifically, I would describe this as a well-practiced list. Again, listening to some of the stuff that Vic and David have talked about, they said that they played like many practice games. Like, we're talking double digits of practice games here, like half a dozen practice games with Guard, and they fine-tuned the list, and they've been tuning it, and they've been honing it in the Crucible of Battle at tournaments as well. And now that it's very, very well refined, and the pilot is, not only very skilled, but also now very practiced with this list specifically, they're getting amazing results with it. But there's a lot of stuff here that won't necessarily work for you back home. If you play on much lighter boards, you'll find that many of these units are fairly fragile. If you try and have your Catachan on the board at the start and there's no ruins for them to hide behind or to scout move behind, the 10 guards in the end of the day, they're just going to die. If you've not got enough ruins or other terrain in your deployment zone to hide your artillery behind, then turn 1, if your opponent gets first turn, well, you'll find suddenly how fragile a Basilisk is. And even if you do have this list and you play on dense terrain regularly, you're going to need to get a few games in to start understanding the kind of movement shenanigans that you can really achieve with units like Catachan, with units like Scout Mirror, with units like the Scout Sentinels. So it's a list that will do very well for you, but don't be surprised if the first 2, 3, 5 games that you run it, you get your face smashed in. But after that, once you start getting a good feel for what your Demolisher cannons can destroy, for how many artillery pieces you need to concentrate onto one type of enemy unit in order to destroy it, you know, what units are priority for your Basilisk, where your Catachan should be deployed and where they can scout move to. When you start getting that experience behind you, then this list will start becoming very, very effective. What I'm trying to say is, it's not necessarily a super hard 5D chess list that you need to pilot with incredible, hitherto unseen levels of skill. It's a list that won't work for you initially, but if you stick with it and you get practice, you don't necessarily need the best player in the world, but to be practiced with it, it'll start doing very well. But in the hands of someone who is, like David, very, very good, and also has practiced with it a lot, and has now taken it into multiple competitive environments, this list is going to be extremely potent. And we've already seen the results with this list winning 130 plus player super major, very shark tanky competitive event. But of course, that's what I think. But all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on this list? What are your thoughts on the individual units that we've seen here? And would you change anything about it? Or how do you think this list might evolve over time if we start seeing the meta shift to adapt to guard and guard artillery? Hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, don't forget to smash that like button. It really does help, guys. And also subscribe to never miss an episode. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian Glory Hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing, truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full-time without the incredible and generous support of my members, so thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a heartfelt thank you to Alex Dengal, Bon Vert, Mad Larkin, Marcus Roberts, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, Try Again Bragg, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Varney. Seriously guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support is incredible and it makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Hope you've all enjoyed today's video, and of course, as always, see you guys next time.